there's a lot of parallelisms in terms of how we approach DEI at Genesys, in terms of how we would approach certain key business initiatives. One is having, a clear vision and a strategy of where you want to go, the ability to be able to measure it and progress along the way. Transparency is another key aspect. And then reporting, being able to measure it operationally. How do we not just count the ants at the end of the game, but how do we actually measure operationally how effectively we're actually changing systems along the way? And I think having, bringing that level of operational expertise to the approach and moving beyond some of your traditional performative work or where it's just feel good work, it really shows up in a way where you can see how it is truly a key business imperative for the company.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the HR Leaders Podcast. On today's episode, I'm joined by Eric Thomas, who's a Vice President of Global Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at Genesys. We discuss how Genesys continues to innovate and drive progress in DE&I and how they hold leaders accountable and keep DE&I initiatives a priority. As always, before we jump into the video, make sure you hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell and follow on your favorite podcast platform. With that being said, let's jump in. Welcome to the show, Eric. How are you?
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me. I'm doing well.
Looking sharp. Look, you should have told me if you was going to go with the pocket square and the blazer, I would have made a bit more of an effort. You're making me feel bad now.
I can always take it off.
No. Love the background.
No, you're looking good, man. You look like you're in your element. So
I mean, this is my element. It's like my second home. A lot of people think it is my home, but I'm like, my wife wouldn't let me have the HR logo on the wall at home. So I was like, it's going to have to be in the studio as well. So this is my home from home as well. I think after spending 2 years in the same house with my wife, I think she's probably happy that I've got another home as well.
Yeah, no doubt.
That I go to. Love your background. Tell me a little bit about the background.
Oh, cool. Yeah, so we have different backgrounds for different occasions, and this is one of the ones that just has the message behind it really is driving engagement across our workforce. To get engaged with, all of the sustainability efforts that we have going on at Genesys, whether it's, the environmental commitments that we've made, as well as our diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it's a very broad mantra that says, join us on our journey, but it's a way to drive employee engagement and the work and the effort.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting how in the last 2 years we've started utilizing our backgrounds? Like just for messaging and for town halls and it's become this new medium almost.
It has. And I think it's one of the many learnings that we took away from the period of the pandemic, right? When we were all forced behind these screens and forced to figure out how to work together in a way that still drives community, drives culture, but you still got folk engaged because you don't have the commute to the office or the coffee time and those types of things in the office. And we, one of the things we've done is leveraged it for part of our communication strategy. How do we, drive awareness and amplify certain messaging? And so you'll see this one, and we've got different ones that we've designed for different cultural events, whether it's celebrating Pride Month or Women's History Month. Just different ways to get folk engaged and to amplify the message.
Yeah, love it. Before we go any further, tell everyone a little bit more about you personally and your journey to the role you're in now.
So I've been with Genesys. I work for Genesys. I have the responsibility of leading our global diversity, equity, and inclusion practice. And for those that may not be aware of who Genesys is, we're a global market leader in the customer experience industry, one of the top providers of call center solutions. And I've been at Genesys since 2018, so about 4.5 years. Mm-hmm. I spent the first 2 years leading a global professional services organization. So diversity work is not my pedigree. It is something that I pivoted to a couple of years ago. I guess as a result of world events and what was going on at the time, coming off of the aftermath of the George Floyd murder in 2020. Mm-hmm. And, since then, since July of 2020, I've had the privilege of, being the company's first chief diversity officer which comes with the responsibility of building out our practices and trying to figure out how to instantiate these concepts across the Genesys enterprise.
That's quite a big undertaking. How did the opportunity come up? Like, how did it come to be? Did someone approach you? Was you already a part of something internally? How did that happen?
No, it's an interesting story, Chris. So as I mentioned before, the catalyst for this was the George Floyd murder. So our CEO, Tony Bates, I think at the time he was only about a year and a half or so in to his post as CEO. He was brought in by the board to help drive the company's transformation from, being more of a premise-based type of company to a true SaaS company. And, in conversations with him, I'd learned later that he'd always had, it was always his intent to ensure that we transform the culture to be more anchored in empathy and an employee focused and people focused. And DEI was on his top 5 things that he wanted to get done. But of course, in the first couple of years, the focus was on go-to-market strategy and business. Sure. Fast forward, you have the George Floyd murder that happened in May of 2020, and you saw almost like every company roll out this playbook, if you will, right? There were statements that were being made, standing in solidarity with the Black community, speaking out against, violence and police brutality and those types of things. And then that statement was typically followed up by some set of actions, right? And so, similar to what you saw around the industry, Genesys, kind of followed suit. Well, I shouldn't say follow suit. They were kind of a leader because they were one of the first ones to speak out on the challenges and the issues at the time. I was asked at the time, I was leading a professional services organization, and I got a call one Sunday afternoon from our chief communications officer asking me to review wording that was getting ready to go out. I think at the time
for the role itself, the actual ad.
No, actually for the statement that was this is prior to the role was being established. This is kind of how it was unfolding. This is the statement you want to put out to the organization. A statement that was going out to the organization and actually to the world, right? It was a publicly made statement. And I was asked to engage to kind of review the wording just to make sure it landed the way it was intended to land. That engagement led to me being involved. Again, this is prior to me becoming the DEI officer, and helping to prep and coordinate for a set of company-wide conversations on race relations. The CEO wanted to lead. He wanted to take advantage of the opportunity to demonstrate what empathy in action looks like. And he wanted to give our employees that same opportunity. And so following the statement was a set of internal conversations around race relations. And the entire company was invited. I think out of the 5,000 or so plus employees that we had at the time, we had nearly 4,000 people join.
Wow.
And I was asked to help prep for in terms of Q&A and actually end up sitting on the panel. That led to a conversation with our CEO asking me about the role, because his next action was to establish a diversity officer and hire a DEI officer. And I guess through my interactions with him and a few others, just kind of working through the aftermath of George Floyd murder and how our employees were responding to it and how we wanted to engage with them, it became a natural fit to say, hey, why don't you consider taking on the role? And I didn't have, of course, don't have a traditional DEI practitioner background. But our approach, we wanted to take a little bit of a different approach, one that would be more operational in nature, because we felt that was a way that would, kind of differentiate us from how a lot of folks were approaching the work, to ensure that we truly had an opportunity at embedding the principles as part of our operating framework. Yeah. And so my operational and business background, along with my passion for the work, was kind of the recipe for me taking on the role.
Love that. And I think that's even more beneficial because, unfortunately, and I'm sure you've seen this, it did spark on many companies to go down this route, the George Floyd, but in many ways, some of them were just doing it for this sort of tick the box exercise. Yeah. And I saw DEI leaders were hired into companies with no budget, no support, no resources. Right. And they left just as fast as they came in. And I had so many conversations, which were so disheartening. with leaders throughout that period. But for you, having the CEO buy-in and operationalizing that and embedding it into the business, that's a good sign immediately from the beginning.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen it as well. In the 2.5 years that I've been immersed in its work, I spent a lot of time with my pulse on the industry and what's happening in the industry, what's working for other companies, what's more importantly, what's not working, and leveraging those learnings to determine our approach at Genesys. And to your point, you can use the term window dressing, or you can call it performative. Number of terms out there that talks to how folk approach the work, how companies approach the work, that limits them to really move beyond real progress, right? And what you'll typically see is a group of organized employees pushing some type of cultural program and cultural learnings, may or may not be funded. There may be some level of training offered to create awareness around what diversity, equity, and inclusion is. And I think it really limits that approach to the work, checks the box, but it limits companies' ability to 100%. Move beyond, status quo and make real progress.
Yeah. Talking about progress and accountability, tell everyone a little bit more about your annual sustainability report, because that's really where you're holding yourselves accountable, which I think is great.
So our sustainability report is a measure towards transparency and self-accountability. And what you'll find in the report, if you look at particularly around the DEI section, is a set of publicly stated goals around diversity, which is very rare. If you look across the industry, I don't know that many companies. I think I read a statistics from a McKinsey report that said that less than 14% of Fortune 500 companies actually have goals, and an even smaller percentage actually publish those goals. Mm-hmm. And so the sustainability report is a vehicle for us to kind of hold ourselves accountable, because in the report, it gives us the opportunity to publicly state what our goals are, right? And we've set representation goals for women globally and various underrepresented populations in the U.S. That is working towards aligning the representation of our workforce with the markets where we serve and where we operate. And so what you'll see in that sustainability report is not just the goals itself, but how we measure progress against the goal and how we've been doing over the past year against some of those goals. And I think it's a great accountability tool, but it's also a way to show the public the work that we're doing, right? A way to demonstrate and amplify the legitimacy of the work at Genesys.
Yeah. And some examples of those, because your team kind of sent it over. So one of the goals is increasing the number of women in leadership roles by 12% across the global workforce, but also having a double-digit growth in diverse representation across the majority of underrepresented groups in North America. So very clear.
I mean, that was some significant progress that we made over the past year, Chris. What you're sharing is annual year-over-year progress. I mean, we grew women in leadership in 1 year to the tune of, it was just a little bit above 12%. And when you look at the various underrepresented populations that in terms of how we're able to measure them in the U.S., we had double-digit growth in just about every category.
Wow.
And again, I think that sustainability tool, that transparency, having the goal, being able to measure progress against the goals, has been a big catalyst in a lot of the progress we've made, because it makes it a serious initiative at Genesys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to go back to what you mentioned earlier about your untraditional approach to this, because I feel like in many ways that could be your strength, because it's quite easy to fall into the traps of traditional approaches to DEI. We talk about this all the time, and the traditional programs, and some of those old ways have not really allowed organizations to make significant progress. How can you continue to innovate and drive progress in DE&I? What advice would you give to our listeners?
I think my background, my non-traditional background, has helped us as a company in terms of how establishing both a strategy and a vision that allows us to take an approach similar to what we would take in the business. There's a lot of parallelism in terms of how we approach DEI at Genesys, in terms of how we would approach certain key business initiatives. One is having, a clear vision and a strategy of where you want to go, the ability to be able to measure it and progress along the way. Transparency is another key aspect. And then reporting, being able to measure it operationally. How do we not just count the ants at the end of the game, but how do we actually measure operationally how effectively we're actually changing systems along the way? And I think having, bringing that level of operational expertise to the approach and moving beyond some of your traditional performative work or where it's just feel good work, it really shows up in a way where you can see how it is truly a key business imperative for the company, right? I mean, for example, we're seeing an increasingly number of customer RFPs coming in, asking us to be able to highlight our commitment to the work and demonstrate, what we're doing in this space. And so we're seeing it, right? And it's playing a key role in our ability to grow the business and land new customer logos, because customers want to see how well we're committed to this business and how we are positioning our product and solutions that enables them to meet the demands of their diversity customer base. It's also been a key weapon in helping us fight the war on attrition, over the past couple of years. I think one of the things we saw during the pandemic is this great reshuffle or great resignation. People use different characterizations.
Yeah.
Whatever you call it, it forces you to reimagine how you source, attract, and hire the best and diverse talent that allows you to stay ahead of the game in terms of innovation, right? Because I think one of the things we also recognize is that having diversity of thought in how you innovate solutions takes them innovations to new heights, right? Mm-hmm. People bringing together folks with different backgrounds and different lived experiences, solving some of the toughest challenges we have in a company, brings a set of outcomes and results that an homogenous thinking set of individuals probably won't come to.
Yeah. Kind of similar way that the team reached out to you in the beginning of your story to get your diverse thoughts and perspectives, right? They could have just put it out there, but they were like, actually, and I'm sure it wasn't just yourself. I'm sure they sent it out to many.
It wasn't just myself, and it was, it was kind of interesting, Chris, because the phone call was like, hey, I hope that this doesn't come the wrong way, but we would like to
because you're a black guy. Can you please take a look at this? And
but at the end of the day, I think it was a courageous move, but it was the right move. Yeah. Because that's how you make sure that's true inclusion, right? If you're saying, hey, we are getting ready to make a statement that's going to represent the company, how about we make sure that especially one that we're hoping is going to land well, that is targeted for the Black community. How about we have someone, a person of color, right? A Black person, to actually be involved in the shaping of it?
Yeah. I want to go back to your statement on measurement. How are you measuring? Is there particular systems and tools you're using? What's the approach you're using in terms of measuring the success and moving the needle on those programs?
Okay. So there are three areas that we tangibly measure, right? I talked about our representation goals to increase, the presence of women globally and in the various underrepresented groups in the U.S. And so we actually have built scorecards that allows us to group by group, and then in aggregate of those groups, measure progress against it, right? We look at our leading indicators in terms of how many, for example, employees that we've hired over the last quarter or month identify as a woman or identify as a Black professional, right? And so those measurements allow us to track how well we are progressing against our representation goal. We also look at attrition, and we look at attrition in a way that we haven't historically looked at it, which is basically through a diversity lens. We unpack the data to be able to look at attrition through various demographics, because we have come to appreciate that making a huge investment in our recruiting engines and our diversity sourcing engines to bring in a more diverse population, that if you aren't able to keep them, then it's a stranded investment. So we're also tracking our ability to actually retain some of the talent that we're coming in. And if there are areas that show up where we see issues, that allows us to understand what actions we need to take.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third thing that we tangibly measure is inclusion and belonging, and really around employee sentiment. How are our employees feeling their ability to show up to be their best and authentic selves each day? And how do they feel about their ability to have an equitable or fair chance at growth and opportunities at Genesys? And probably 6 months into launching the diversity office, we rolled out our inclusion index that allows us to take the data from our annual employee survey and any post surveys that we do, disaggregate the responses from all of our different employees and look at it through various demographic lens. How are women responding? How are our Latino professionals responding? And see if there's any disparity when indexing one group's set of responses against another group or even against the whole, and then what actions can be taken from there. And so those are three ways that we tangibly measure the progress of our diversity effort.
Just out of curiosity, like what ATS system are you using? What are you using on that side?
So today we use Taleo, right?
Okay.
One of the more common ATS systems that I think a lot of companies use.
Nice. Just always interesting because there's so many platforms out there now, and especially in the last couple of years, companies have made significant investments in that space.
They're making significant investments, and what I'm also seeing is that the heightened level of focus on diversity over the past couple of years is also pushing companies, HCM companies, to evolve their DEI reporting capabilities. It has not been a part of their traditional modules.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've had conversations with a number of our third-party, tools and companies that we work with to challenge them on this, right? Because you can get the traditional HCM reporting that tells you hiring trends and attrition, but the ability to disaggregate views and unpack it in a way that looks at it through a diversity lens and smoke out disparities, smoke out inequities, there's a lot of work to be done in the industry there.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of work. Yeah, there's a lot of work being. That's one of the great things that's come out of this, is that there's a lot of work being done in that space as well. One question I wanted to ask you mentioned earlier around the George Floyd reaction, and obviously that kind of sparked this whole journey. How do you decide whether a company should comment on a particular event? Like, because some companies avoided it, like we saw. Some companies went straight in. Sometimes it felt really inauthentic. We all saw the sort of companies that it felt cringe to even see their response because it was so. Even their employees internally are like, "Wait a minute, this is not what's happening internally." Yet you have this social media face. How do you decide, like, how personally you, the team, which things you get involved in, you don't, if that makes sense?
It does make sense. So as part of our corporate communications framework, we evolved it to create this rubric that we triage around when a world event occurs, when a social event occurs.
Mm-hmm.
You take the last example was with the overturning the decision of Roe versus Wade.
Yeah.
It's one of the top challenges that I think companies and CDOs are facing, because I think you're going to see even more of those types of events occurring. And one of the things that we ask ourselves is, when it happens, how do we come to a decision as to whether we make a statement, we speak out, or take action, or what that action is going to be? So as part of that framework, we added a rubric to the framework that allows us to certain key principles within the company. Our chief communications officer, myself as the chief diversity officer, and depending on what the issue is, we might bring in the head of HR, we might even bring in our CEO at times, and we run through a set of questions that we curated for this rubric. And really, the set of questions are designed to help us come to a decision that is anchored on: is it aligned with our corporate values? Is it aligned with who we are, our identity as a company? And certain questions like, have we spoke out on something like this before? If we do, is there a reputational risk here within the business community, with our customers? How will our employees respond or react if we do or don't respond? Do we have the credibility to respond
Great. That's a great
and
question.
speak out in this situation,
Yeah.
right? So these are the types of questions that we've curated that makes up
Nice.
that rubric. And it's battle tested every time an event occurs. Every time an event occurs.
Love that. Yeah, so many companies are lost on that. It's so great to hear that you have a process in place, and I'm sure it's taken time to tweak it as well. I'm sure it wasn't perfect from day one.
It's a living process, and that's what I mean by battle tested, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even the last time with Roe versus Wade, when we broke it out and we were triaging around the questions, we realized, okay, wait a minute, there's some other things we need to consider here, because now you have to start anticipating what's coming next, right? We have a potential shift in the judiciary in the U.S. that may occur in the upcoming November elections. What will that mean if a more conservative party takes over?
Yeah.
And you start seeing more types of decisions or reversals on a historical human right like Roe versus Wade. And so I think this is something that's front of mind for a lot of CEOs and a lot of folk are trying to prepare themselves in some way, whether it's a communications rubric or whatever it is, to understand how they plan for these types of scenarios.
Yeah. I think it's been fascinating to witness the role that organizations play in people's lives, because I never really thought I'd see a time where people look towards their businesses and their companies for guidance. Like
I think what we've seen, Chris, is a breakdown and a loss of trust in our traditional systems, our government systems,
yes.
right? And not just in the U.S., around the world,
everywhere,
right? Yeah. And during the pandemic, I think that was where a lot of it came to a height. I saw a report that McKinsey put out not too long ago from some surveys that they issued and the collective responses around where are people placing their trust, right? And you see this shift from the government to business leaders and corporations. And you see where a lot of business leaders are stepping up and kind of taking on that responsibility, and it moves them beyond, just your traditional approach on driving shareholder value. Now you have to consider a much broader stake of shareholders in your decision making. And I think a lot of the trust in our traditional systems have been eroded. How certain leaders responded to the pandemic or didn't respond, the uncertainty around the pandemic, and now you see other macroeconomic pressures that we're facing with uncertainty around inflation and all these other types of things. It just seems like there's a continuous erosion and a trust of our traditional systems that's now landing on business leaders.
Yeah, that was one of the things that kept coming up from the CHROs I interviewed on the show. They're like, Chris, I'm being asked all of these questions that I've never been asked before. All of a sudden, I'm now responsible for the physical health and safety of tens of thousands of employees, and they're looking to me and my team for advice on how to stay safe, for example, during the pandemic, or how do we react to George Floyd, and these are all unprecedented things in organized and leaders. As the role, fundamentally, the role of a leader has changed. What it means to be a leader.
The role of a leader, and I'll tell you, one of the things I did not anticipate in taking on this diversity leadership role is just how broad the role would be. I'm thinking, from my watching, my experience on the peripheral of understanding the work. You focus on workplace initiatives, you focus on diversity recruiting, you focus on making people feel a sense of belonging. I didn't anticipate becoming part of the company's chief crisis communications officer, chief counselor to certain folk. It's a very broad array of hats that you wear in a role that World Events is driving.
Yeah. What would you say? Obviously, being how long in a role now? 2 years, roughly. Right?
Approaching 2.5 years.
Yeah. What did you wish you knew coming into it that you know now?
That's a great question. I think understanding or being able to anticipate better what I would call organized opposition, right? when I came into this role a little over 2.5 years ago, there was a heightened sense of excitement and enthusiasm for the work, right? You even saw a number of reports talking about the number of CDOs that were being appointed at, double-digit increases in the presence, the company stepping up to show their commitment to the work and to be more focused on the principles behind the work. I think that, now what we've seen is an awakening of the opposition, right? An organized opposition that is challenging the work in the way that, it's showing up from one state to the next, mostly conservative states, right? When you're seeing laws about how certain books can or cannot can't show up in the classroom, or you can't have conversations around a person's, around the LGBT community. Certain things can't be discussed in certain environments, right?
Yes.
And I think knowing that coming in would probably have allowed us to get in front of some of these challenges sooner, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think we're focused on them now. We're kind of adjusting our strategy for how to plan and measure against organized opposition. But I think coming into this at the time, I think we underestimated how folk would wake up to this work. Folk who may not believe or may not ascribe to the work, and what their reactions would be.
Mm-hmm. To be fair, I don't think anyone could have seen if you kind of went back 2 years ago and told us all of these events were going to unfold, everyone would have said you're crazy.
Right.
It was like this storm of events. Like one thing after another. It's just I don't think I can't imagine a time in my lifetime anyway where it's been like that.
Same here. I think that there was a level of hope, and excitement around the work, that, there was an expectation that there was a shift in the tide.
Yes.
And folk were riding that wave, that emotional wave that came along with it. But the reality set in that, okay, there's going to be some folk that do not ascribe to this work, and you need to plan how do you build out a set of sustainable practices that can endure that.
Mm-hmm. Now you've had 2 years in the seat. What advice would you give to people coming into the role for the first time?
I would advise folk, to not underestimate the inclusion aspect of the work. I think that companies get so caught up on the diversity piece, the recruiting piece, because it can also almost become kind of a check the box. If you feel like that, hey, you're increasing representation, you have more women, you have more brown faces, you have more black faces, in the company, then you're making progress. And that's really only one element of the solution. It's not just about bringing, an increased diverse representation into your workforce. It's about making sure that you're making space for them to actually feel like they can show up in a way where they can add value to the business and to whatever your corporate objectives are, and that they have a voice. And so I would strongly advise folks not to underestimate the inclusion and belonging aspect of this work. It is equally important as any of the diversity recruiting and some of the things that you can more tangibly measure in terms of the elements of the work.
I think if anything, you need to get that right first. Because if you
have to get that right first.
If you're bringing people into an organization where they don't feel included, they don't feel like they belong, like we said earlier, they're just going to leave just as fast as they come in. And I see companies doing that, and they have this huge turnover. Like, they don't know why. Because you haven't changed fundamentally the culture and building that culture of belonging, that culture of inclusion. And that's not, and systematically you have to go through every single stage of that process and look at every single part of that journey and figure that out. So I think that's great advice.
And I would say, Chris, because we started with inclusion, right? We started with that work of getting our employees engaged and establishing these various communities within the company. That I think that's one of the many ways that differentiates our approach, how we've approached the work at Genesys, and that it also has provided us some of the early successes that we've had that makes this a more attractive
It's also, yeah,
destination for a
exactly. It's
lot
also
of
why
big
you're
people of
attracting
color.
them. Exactly.
Right,
That's why you are attracting the people, and that's why they're
right,
staying because they can see it.
right,
Or that's why they're joining in the first place. You can't do it the other
right,
way around, as
right.
well. No, I love that. Listen, before I let you go, I wish I had more time. There's so much more I want to ask you, but what are you excited about the most as we look forward into the years ahead? What are you most excited about?
I think one of the things I'm mostly excited about is, looking at kind of this next phase of our journey, right? We started a journey in the short 2 years to 2.5 years of been at this work. We started, as I mentioned, with inclusion, and then we worked with a number of our HR partners across the various HR disciplines to see to ensure we are embedding DEI principles within how the various policies, practices, and procedures that are administered that has an impact on the employee experience, right? So that was all around equity and inclusion. And now we're going to be turning our focus to integrating it more tightly within the business. When I look at the various business leaders and functional leaders across the company, how do we make sure that they feel that they have a sense of proprietorship in this work? If this isn't something that's just done in a small corner with me and my small team,
Mm-hmm.
how do they feel a sense of ownership in this? And so we are turning towards embedding within the operating fabric of each one of the businesses their own set of disaggregated DEI goals and expanding the transparency at more micro levels to help them understand the role they play
Yeah.
in helping us achieve our broader goals, right? And what actions, if any, they need to have as part of their key operating or ways of working to help us achieve these goals. So I'm really excited about that. And I think we have a group of leaders at Genesys that are embracing the work and they're excited about having it fold into a part of their operating rhythm.
Mm-hmm. It needs to live with everyone in the business,
Right.
not just you and the team.
Right.
This is not just for a function.
Right.
Say the same thing about HR as well. The leaders need to take ownership of that. We need to help support them, obviously, and give them the tools and everything that they need. But they also need to own it and be part of their own deliverables, how they're measured in their function.
Right.
But also they need to see the value of what it brings
Right.
to each of their
Right.
organizations. Like we mentioned earlier, the innovation, the diversity of thought, and how that filters down to your product and then to your customers. There's so many, right. and I think that's one of the things that companies struggle with, beyond the social crises, these impacts, is how do you sustain DE&I in the organization, beyond those events, if that makes sense.
It does.
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah. Well, listen, last question, where can people connect with you? If they want to reach out to you personally, say hi, say hello, where can they reach you?
I mean, you can catch me on LinkedIn. I'm not a big social person, but I do have a LinkedIn account, and I'm very responsive there. They can, if you come to the Genesys website at genesys.com, we have a landing page that highlights a lot of the great work that that's happening, diversity work at Genesys. So you can connect with me there as well.
Amazing. So everyone for listening, the link to connect will be, with Eric, will be in the description. So no matter what platform you're on, it's below. Also a link I'll find that page on your website. We'll also link that in the comments below, Bruno, as well. But apart from that, thanks so much for joining. And I'm really happy for you that you found this role and you feel like it was a match made in heaven. It was meant to be. And congratulations to you and the team for all the amazing work. And I wish you all the best until we next speak.
Thanks, Chris. I really appreciate you having me today. Truly enjoyed the conversation.
No worries. Have a good day. See you later.